Chapter 5. Doc Miley had luck on his side, better than he had anticipated. He was able to practice medicine for an entire Earth year, traveling from village to village to provide his services wherever they were needed. During the early stages of colonization, the village he was currently in had become isolated due to Mars's weak attempt to break free from the space lobby. As a result, their supplies were cut off and they were forced to fend for themselves. However, they had become largely self-sufficient by growing native plants and extracting hormones in small, basic chemical plants. These hormones were then traded to larger chemical plants for a small amount of money to buy necessities from Earth. They had also created makeshift methods of synthesizing their own food. Despite their challenges, they learned to live off of what Mars provided. Doc Miley learned from them, and money was no longer a part of his life. He ate with whichever family needed him and seamlessly assimilated into their way of life. As he delved into Martian medicine, Doc realized that his earthly education was mostly useless. The villagers didn't trust the lobby doctors, so he had set up his own laboratory and started making Mars-normal penicillin, a primitive but better-than-nothing antibiotic. Jake reminded him of his first anniversary, and they smoked bracky together. Doc admitted that someone might die under his care with his limited equipment. Jake suggested that Mars might break free from the lobbies, and Doc couldn't help but agree. He had been talking rebellion for months, and the villagers were making Mars their own. However, the lobby still had power, and Stan was trying to prove that Doc was at fault for a death in Newton Village. She was using blackmail to cut off anyone taking treatment from an herb doctor, which could mean letting people die. Jake pointed out that it could also mean letting people begin to think about getting rid of the lobby. Doc was willing to operate, but Jake warned him to keep the serious cases a secret. Doc watched Jake leave, and then headed to his crude laboratory to work on the mystery of the black spots. Without a microscope, he was almost helpless, but he had taken specimens and tried to culture them. The civilizations on Mars had expanded, even if they were only unknown fungi or bacteria. Although Mars was dry and lacked air, some plants and insects had survived and adapted. It was not a lifeless planet. Without a microscope, there was little that could be done except rely on case files. However, new evidence had emerged. A villager had stolen an Earth medical journal from Stan Tanana's tractor and sent it to him. He found black specks mentioned in a single paragraph about skin diseases. An investigation of the diet was underway, as all cases were among people who ate synthetic food. Another article discussed aberrant cases, a few strange behaviors and classical syndromes. He studied it, wondering if it was the same thing. The diet did not explain why the specks appeared only when the patient was near death, nor did it account for the hard lump at the base of the neck found in every case he could check. That might be a coincidence, but he doubted it. Whatever it was, it aggravated any other disease the patient had and made seemingly simple diseases turn out to be completely and rapidly fatal. Once syphilis had been called the Great Imitator. This gave promise of being worse. He shook his head, cursing his lack of equipment. Each month more people were dying with these specks, and he was helpless. Suddenly, a concealed door broke open, and a boy thrust his head in. "Doc, there's a man here from Einstein. Says his wife's dying." The man was already coming into the room. "She's powerful sick, Doc. Had a bellyache, fever, began throwing up. Pains under her belly like she's had before, but this time it's awful." Doc asked him a few questions, frowning at what he heard, then began packing the few things that might help. There should be no appendicitis on Mars. The bugs responsible for that shouldn't have adapted to Mars normal. But more and more infections found ways to cross the border. Gangrene had been able to get by without change, it seemed. So far, none of the contagious infections except polio and the common cold had made the jump. This sounded like an advanced case, perhaps already involving peritonitis. So far, he'd been lucky with penicillin, but each time he used it with grave doubts of its action on the Mars-adapted patients. If the appendix had burst, however, it was the only possible treatment. He rifled through his stores. There was enough ether, fortunately. The villagers had made that for him out of Martian plants, using their complicated fermentation processes. He yelled for Jake, and the boy brought the old man back a moment later. "Jake, I'll need more of that narcotic stuff. I don't want the woman writhing and tearing her stitches after the ether wears off." "Can't get it, Doc." Jake's eyes seemed to cloud as he said it. "Distilling plant broke down. Doc, I don't like this case. That woman's been to the hospital 3 times. I hear she just got out recently. This might be a plant, or they figure they can't help her. They're afraid to try anything on Mars' normal flesh." "They cannot be proven wrong if they do nothing," Doc said, as he finished packing his bag. "Either I am a doctor or I am not. I cannot worry when a woman may be dying." Jake's expression was stubborn for a moment, before the little crow's feet around his eyes deepened, and he let out a dry chuckle. "Right, Dr. Miley," he said, flipping up his thumb and shuffling off toward the tractor. Lou and the man from Einstein followed Doc into the machine. The ride was silent, except for Doc's questions about the sick woman. Her husband, George Lynn, was evasive and probably ignorant. He admitted that Harriet had been to the dispensary and small infirmary that Southport called a hospital. It was the only place in the entire southern hemisphere where an operation could be performed legally. Most cases had to go to Northport, but Stan had been trying to expand. Apparently, she was determined to make Southport into another major center before she was called back to Earth. Doc wondered why the villagers went there. They had no medical insurance with the lobby. They couldn't afford it. Most villagers didn't have the cash either. They were forced to mortgage their future work and that of their families to the drug plants that were run by the lobby. "And they just turned your wife away?" Doc asked. He couldn't quite believe that of Stan. "Well, I don't know. She wouldn't talk much. Twice she went and they gave her something. Cost every cent I could borrow. Then this last time they kept her a couple days before they let me come and get her. But now she's a lot worse." Jake spun about, suddenly tense. "How'd you pay them last time, George?" "Why, they didn't ask. I told her she could put up 6 months from me and the kids, but nobody said nothing about it. Just gave her back to me." He frowned slowly, his dull voice uncertain. "They told me they'd done all they could, not to bring her back. That's why she was so strong on getting Doc." "I don't like it," Jake said flatly. "It stinks. They always charge. George, did they suggest she get in touch with Doc here?" "Maybe they did. Maybe not. Harriet did all the talking with them. I just do what she tells me, and she said to get Doc." Jake swore. "It smells like a trap. Are you sure she's sick, George?" "I felt her head and she sure had a fever." George Lynn was torn between his loyalties. "You know me, Doc. You fixed me up that time I had the red pip. I wouldn't pull nothing on you." Doc had a feeling that Jake was probably right, but he vetoed the suggestion that they stop to look for spies. He had no time for that. If the woman was really sick, he had to get to her at once, and even that might be too late. He remembered the woman, sickly from other treatment. He'd been forced to remove her inflamed tonsils a few months before. She'd whined and complained because he couldn't spend all his time attending her. She was a nag, a shrew, and a completely selfish woman. But that was her husband's problem, not his. He rushed into the small house when they arrived at Einstein, and his first glance confirmed what George Lynn had said. The woman was sick, all right. She was running a high fever, much too high. She began whining and protesting at his taking so long, but the pain soon forced her to stop. "There may still be a chance," Doc told her husband brusquely. He threw the cleanest sheet onto a table and shoved it under the single light. "Keep out of the way. In the other room, if you can all pile in there. This isn't exactly sterile, anyway. You can boil a lot of water if you want to help." It would give them something to do, and he could use the water to clean up. There was no time to wait for it, however. He had to sterilize with alcohol and carbolic acid and hope. He bent over the woman, ripping her thin gown across to make room for the operation. Then he swore. Across her abdomen was the unhealed wound of a previous operation. They had worked on her at Southport. They must have removed the appendix and then been shocked by the signs of infection. They weren't supposed to release a sick patient, but there was an easy out for them. They could remove her from the danger of spreading an unknown infection. Some doctors must have doped her up on sedatives and painkillers and sent her home, knowing that she would call him. For that matter, they might have noticed her unrecorded tonsillectomy and considered her fair game. He grabbed the ether and slapped a cone over her nose. She tried to protest. She never cooperated in anything. But the fumes of the ether he dipped onto the packing of the cone soon overcame that. It was peritonitis, of course. The only thing to do was to go in and scrape and clean as best he could. It was a rotten job to have to do, and he should have had help. But he gritted his teeth and began. He couldn't trust anyone else to hold the instruments, even. He cleaned the infection as best he could, knowing there was almost no chance. He used all the penicillin he dared. Then he began sewing up the incision. It was all he could do, except for dressing the wound with a sterile bandage. He reached for one and stopped. While he had been working, the woman had died, far more quietly than she had ever lived. It was probably the only gracious act of her life. But it was damning to Doc. They couldn't hide her death, and any investigation would show that someone had worked on her. To the lobby, he would be the one who had murdered her. Jake was waiting in the tractor. He took one look at Doc's face and made no inquiries. They were more than a mile away when Jake pointed back. Small in the distance, but distinct against the sands, a grey Medical Corps tractor was coming. Either they had a spy in the village, or they had guessed the rate of her infection very closely. They must have harbored the hope of capturing Doc in the act, and they had scarcely missed their chance. However, this would prove inconsequential. The photographic evidence and any coerced testimony from the village would likely suffice to condemn Doc.